From the very first chapter of my book, The Secret of Vigor, I want readers to understand that chronic stress is the main enemy of vigor. In this video, I want to explore with you some of the ways in which stress leads to disruptions in biochemical balance in the other four pillars of health: oxidation, inflammation, and glycation, which we've already talked about in previous videos. Those disruptions can result in low vigor and poor health if we aren't careful to control either our exposure to stress or the way in which our bodies respond to stress. Before looking at what happens on the biochemical level, let's briefly review the basics of chronic stress. Human beings were simply not meant to carry around constant disturbances in our stress response, to the point that this stress response reaches the state we call chronic stress. We were, however, built to respond to stress quickly and then to have our stress hormones dissipate immediately. That's the acute stress response, or as discussed in The Secret of Vigor, the temporary stress response. When our bodies are exposed to wave after wave of chronic stress from our modern lifestyles, they begin to break down. Animals don't normally harbor chronic stress the way humans do, but even when they do, during stress experiments for instance, they get sick just like we humans do. In study after study, it quickly becomes obvious that the stress response, while acting as our friend in certain situations, turns against us when the body begins to perceive everyday events as stressful events. Over time, stress-related diseases result from either an over-exaggerated stress response, too much response to what should have been a small stressor, or an under-exaggerated ability to shut down the stress response, which causes the stress response and the stress hormone cortisol to remain elevated and biochemical balance to fall apart. Because our modern world rarely requires the evolutionary fight or flight response to stress, we deny our bodies their natural physical reaction to stress. Unfortunately, the brain still registers stress in the same way as it always has, but because we no longer react to that stress with vigorous physical activity, fighting or running away, our bodies store the stress response and continue to churn out high levels of stress hormones. Before we know it, we find ourselves suffering with feeling tired, stressed, depressed, or simply burned out. And we feel as if we have no control over the many stressors in our lives. In one of the more ironic twists visited upon us as humans as higher animals, our brains are so well developed that our bodies have learned to respond to psychological stress with the same hormonal cascade that occurs with exposure to a physical stressor. This means that just by our thinking about a stressful event, even if that event is highly unlikely to actually occur, our endocrine system gets into an uproar and starts to interfere with our biochemical balance, leading us toward burnout. A number of different biomarkers have been used in studies of chronic stress and stress hormone balance. In the Secret of Vigor book, I delve into some of these biomarkers in some detail, including testosterone, cortisol, norepinephrine, dopamine, interleukin, C-reactive peptide. But for our purposes in this video, all of these biomarkers can be summed up as one thing, and that's balance. When you're out of balance, problems start to occur. If we experience stressful events on a regular basis and are unable to effectively rid ourselves of the stressor, then our cortisol levels stay constantly elevated above normal levels. The elevation of cortisol leads to further problems with biochemical balance, such as reduced testosterone, and interference with other hormones, such as thyroid hormone and insulin. This process can be compared to what happens with a line of dominoes, where tipping one hormone off balance, cortisol, leads to a disruption in the next, testosterone, and the next, insulin, and the next, serotonin, and the next, thyroid, and so on and so forth, until eventually the balance of our entire system is upset and you feel terrible. Also lined up like dominoes are the other pillars of health, where cortisol excess increases levels of inflammatory cytokines and oxidative free radicals and glycating sugars. This increase in stress-induced oxidation and inflammation is due in part to the fact that excess cortisol stimulates a chronic immune system response, which is accompanied by a respiratory burst from macrophages and related cells. And this response is also partly due to the increased creation of AGEs, advanced glycation end products, that are triggered by cortisol-induced elevations in blood sugar. Scientific research and medical evidence clearly show that a sustained level of cortisol triggered by chronic unrelenting stress and leading to a cascade of other biochemical disruptions has debilitating effects on long-term health. Among these many effects is an increase in appetite and cravings for certain foods, especially sweets. Because one of the primary roles of cortisol is to encourage the body to refuel itself after responding to a stressor, an elevated cortisol level also keeps your appetite ramped up, so you feel hungry almost all the time. In addition, the type of fat that accumulates as a result of this stress-induced appetite will typically locate itself in the abdominal region of the body, probably so it's more readily available for release during the next stress response. The major problem with abdominal fat, however, aside from the fact that nobody wants a potbelly, is that this type of fat is also highly associated with increased cellular damage from glycating sugars, oxidative free radicals, and inflammatory cytokines, all of which increase risk for the development of heart disease, diabetes, and certain cancers. So now you have a bit of appreciation for the challenges to biochemical balance that chronic stress causes in the body. When cortisol levels go up or its normal rhythm is disrupted, a cascade of biochemical events is set in motion which disrupts other hormones. Elevated cortisol also unbalances the ratio between various neurotransmitters, dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin and many others, as well as metabolic proteins like cytokines, which are involved in inflammation. So you can quickly see how stress in our lives can easily disrupt each of the biochemical pillars of health. Stress researchers, including myself, frequently study competitive athletes. For obvious reasons, athletes are extremely interested in balancing the dose of stress that they deliver to their bodies with the amount of recovery necessary for optimal performance. Counteracting the muscle wasting and the fat gaining effects of prolonged cortisol exposure becomes a large part of maximizing performance gains while minimizing the risk for illness and injury. For many athletes, the delicate balance between training stress and recovery poses a significant dilemma. To become faster and more competitive, you have to train hard. But training too hard without adequate recovery will just make you slow because you'll be tired or you'll get sick or you'll get hurt. Athletes who excel at the highest levels are those who are most adept at balancing the three primary components of their program: training, diet, and recovery. A phenomenon known as overtraining syndrome has been linked to chronic cortisol exposure, exactly the same situation that we all face in our battle with daily stressors and our struggle to maintain biochemical balance and high vigor. Although chronic overtraining is easy to recognize by its common symptoms of constant fatigue, mood fluctuations, and reduced mental and physical performance, sounds a lot like burnout and lack of vigor suffered by many non-athletes, it may be difficult to detect in its earlier stages, just like the early stages of stress. Therefore, competitive athletes, like each of us, need to become adept at balancing our exposure to stress with recovery from stress in order to approach the optimal physical and mental performance that they and we are looking for in our daily lives. As I mentioned earlier, just as overexposure to certain hormones is detrimental to health, so is underexposure. Consider the effect of the primary stress hormone cortisol on the brain. We've known about the links between stress and depression for decades, and in the United States alone, stress-related depression accounts for more than $30 billion in medical expenses and lost productivity. Researchers at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College in London have determined that stress-related depression actually progresses in two distinct phases. The first phase is characterized by an overexposure to cortisol, creating a toxic effect whereby too much cortisol actually destroys crucial brain cells responsible for good mood. The second phase is a compensatory mechanism where the brain becomes resistant to the effects of cortisol as a way to protect itself from cortisol's damaging effects. So the brain cells are now deprived of cortisol, creating a dramatic underexposure that leads to a host of memory and psychological problems. Unfortunately, this syndrome of cortisol resistance leads to a deepening of depression and symptoms of fatigue and confusion, a combination that's very much like the symptoms seen in people with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. A similar scenario occurs for other hormones, whereby over or underexposure leads to a host of physical and psychological dysfunction, which are alleviated upon restoring metabolic balance. Remember that vigor is not only a measure of our physical health, but also of our mental state and our mental functioning. Because the overexposure or underexposure of cortisol in the brain can destroy a good mood and lead to depression, fatigue, and confusion, you can begin to see how an imbalance in stress hormones can negatively impact your vigor. In some respects, you can think of certain aspects of stress hormone balance in the same way that you might think about getting too little, enough, or too much exercise. Some is good, too little is bad, and too much is also bad. Thinking back to our overtrained athletes who are overstressed physically and mentally, they often have low levels of cortisol during exercise when they should be high, but high levels during rest when they should be low. These out-of-sync cortisol levels indicate that the bodies of these athletes are still under stress and out of biochemical balance, perhaps from injury or infection or from inadequate recovery. These athletes also experience fatigue, weight gain, depressed mood, and poor performance. Numerous studies show convincingly that reducing biochemical stress, including restoring balance between various measures such as cortisol, testosterone, glucose, cytokines, and many others, also reduces the risk of dying and increases our lifespan. Positive changes in psychological measurements of stress, such as a greater sense of meaningfulness in life, have also been associated with improvements in biochemical balance markers. This psychobiochemical effect appears to cut both ways, however, because individuals with downward financial mobility, such as losing a job, tend to have higher indices of cortisol and cytokines, and those individuals with the highest financial stress, such as poverty, have been shown to have a striking 6-year shorter life expectancy that's directly attributable to an increased disease risk from excessive metabolic stress. In similar fashion, the risk of developing burnout, chronic fatigue syndrome, or post-traumatic stress disorder has recently been shown to be approximately 3 times higher in subjects with elevated psychological stress and dysregulations across the 4 pillars of health. Numerous forms of stress management exist, and there are many fine references available on that topic. But my own book, The Secret of Vigor, takes the view that although stress management techniques have been around for decades, very few of those regimens have made much of an impact on the health or well-being of the average person. This fact has nothing to do with the techniques being ineffective. They certainly work if you can actually put them into practice. For many people, however, wedging another stress management tool into their already busy lives does little more than add another source of stress. I know that some stress management gurus will disagree with me, but from a purely practical point of view, as well as my position as a nutritional biochemist and an exercise physiologist, most people can't be bothered with traditional approaches to stress management. And many of us rarely take the time to exercise or eat the way we know we should, both of which could go a long way toward reducing the detrimental effects of stress on our bodies. Giving up on old, unhealthy habits like grabbing a fast food meal when we're feeling stressed instead of sitting down to a nutritious dinner is always a challenge. But besides the difficulties of changing behavior, I believe we do not take advantage of stress busters like exercise or dietary supplements simply because the idea that stress can seriously damage our health has simply not sunk in for most of us, including for much of the medical profession. For example, most everyone knows that smoking is bad for you, and we have systematically reduced the number of places where cigarette smoking is allowed. I don't think we've reached that critical mass of opinion about the impact of stress, though. In the opening pages of the Secret of Vigor book, I stated that I believe it's just as important to get your stress levels under control as it is to eat a healthy diet or get physical activity. Once you let that idea sink in, and once you let the information you've learned about how much damage stress can do to your heart, your brain, and your overall health, I believe you'll naturally begin to adopt the behaviors that will help you balance your stress hormones. To make it easier for you, I've outlined the best strategies for restoring balance across your personal 4 pillars of health, and I've grouped them into several categories that I defined as Vigor Improvement Practices, or VIP. You'll find the details of these practices in the last part of the Secret of Vigor book, Part 3, which I designed for people asking what to do to restore vigor and build their vigor back to where it used to be. The best thing to do is to take small steps, and I've intentionally kept my recommendations simple so you can easily incorporate them into your lifestyle. You should also be encouraged by the fact that thousands of participants in my programs have successfully used these practices and enjoyed noticeable benefits in relatively short periods of time without undue hardship or inconvenience in their already busy and stressful lives. I'm confident the same results are available to you. I hope that this series of videos about the 4 pillars of health have given you an appreciation of the importance of restoring biochemical balance within each and between each of these 4 pillars. In some ways, it may seem that balancing stress hormones is the most important task in restoring vigor because these hormones are the master controllers of your biochemistry. But as stated throughout these videos and throughout the entire Secret of Vigor book, the pillars are interdependent and intertwined with each other, so it makes sense to strengthen all of them simultaneously in order to create a truly comprehensive approach to optimal health and improved vigor. As with the example of the dominoes from earlier, if you make a positive change in regard to one of these pillars, you'll set off positive reactions in all the rest of the pillars, and you'll feel better with improved vigor as a result. Good luck. This is Dr. Sean Talbott. Thanks for watching.